Welcome, Rodrigo. Nice to virtually meet you.
Nice to meet you, Heidi.
For people who will be joining either through video or reading this interview, perhaps you could do a bit of an introduction about your work. I know that we're going to talk about 499, your latest documentary or hybrid film, but you have other work that you've done in the past, so maybe start there.
Yes, absolutely. So, Heidi, my name is Rodrigo Reyes, and I'm a Mexican-American director. My work is really built on these in-between spaces between these two universes of Mexico and the US, and kind of the stories that are caught, you know, like in the struggle of these two universes. I made a film called Purgatorio, which is about the US-Mexico border. And that film really kind of captures the border as if it was like a surreal landscape, closer to like something that comes out of like Dante, or like this kind of metaphorical space where we're stuck between heaven and earth. I made a film also about a personal story of my grandpa who got lost in the US for many years while he was a migrant worker. So I invented this fiction to try to figure out what happened to my grandpa and what happens to all of these men that leave families behind in Mexico, and then, you know, like they encounter this very like deep existential crisis of why did they come to the US, at what cost did they come to work in this country. And then with 499, I'm working with the history of Mexico, with this idea of the Spanish conquest, which happened in 1521 when the Aztecs surrendered. And so the film follows the footsteps of a conquistador who time travels into modern Mexico and has to repeat the steps of Cortez from the coastline into Mexico City. And on that route, he has to actually listen to real people who are not actors, who are real victims of modern violence in Mexico. So he listens to all these different testimonies that unfold the different layers of Mexican violence. And at the same time, he's reflecting on his own actions. And there's this connection that becomes to, you know, like comes to light in the film, where we realize that violence has continued to be perpetuated in different forms across the centuries. So, for instance, he meets the son of a murdered journalist, and the conquistador reflects on how they, you know, destroyed a lot of information and a lot of culture when they arrived, and how there's a big similarity between erasing and burning somebody's books and killing a journalist, right? And so there's a very kind of sci-fi, surreal depiction of a very real problem of this continuation of colonialism that we see happening in countries across the world, not just in Mexico. You know,
Yeah,
in Canada, I was just going to say, like we see it in Canada, right? Like there's a discussion around like the whole policy and the lasting effects of boarding schools. And I think it's a time where we're confronting history, and that's kind of where 499 appears.
Yeah, and I appreciate you putting it so eloquently, because I think that's what gravitates. The film has done really well in the film festival circuit and in different parts of the world, because it is that universal message of, you know, how do we deal with our history, positive and negative aspects of history. And I'm curious about how the film kind of came to be, because you did talk about your other films having this metaphorical aspect to it, and 499 is a hybrid film. As you mentioned, there's someone who's acting as the conquistador, but then we're meeting real people. So maybe talk about your influences in your filmmaking, just to start.
Well, I really wanted to do a film about history that wasn't like stodgy, that wasn't preachy, that wasn't full of experts. I wanted to show how history operates in real life. And a lot of people have asked me, like, well, why did you pick a conquistador when all the stories are so potent in the film? Well, in a very dramatically true way, I think, like the conquistador is real. He's real. He's, you know, being played by an actor, but he embodies a very real, like, social cultural phenomenon. He exists in the shadows of Mexican culture. And so, you know, part of the influences for this really came from filmmakers like Luis Buñuel, who would just create these like really interesting contradictions on screen, and he would play with our expectations to show a deeper truth. And I understand that for diehard documentary lovers, it might seem like the film is breaking a lot of rules, but I would say we need to document the real truths that are impacting our lives. We need to document the truths that are making an impact on people. And sometimes we need to break the rules because sometimes the rules are part of the problem, you know, because if the film were to just say, oh, okay, let's ask a regular person who has suffered violence, like a mother, or, you know, searching for her son, or Central American migrants, let's ask them to reflect on the conquest. You're actually colonizing them because you're setting them up for failure, because you're not taking into account that, you know, the way that they have lived their lives and the factors that are pressuring them don't allow them to have those reflections. Like, we need to make those connections. That's our job as artists, right? So I really felt strongly that seeing this conquistador was important, because in many ways, you see, when you see him with his armor and his sword and everything, he represents power. He represents our idea of power. And that is important because these people get to talk to power, which, as we see over and over across the world, there's this big disparity of silence, right? Like, power always wants to impose a story, it never wants to listen to somebody else's story. And that's very true in Mexico. None of the victims in the film have been able to really engage with policy making at the highest level, and that's what they want. They want to be a part of, like, the laws and the strategies to diminish violence, and many of them have been ignored.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you mentioned that, because there is this sense that the conquistador is bearing witness to these stories, and he is sort of opening these gates, if you will, of allowing citizens to speak their truth, but also be seen and heard in a manner that they haven't been able to be seen or heard in the past, as you mentioned. Could you talk about your relationship with the people that you approached for the film? Because I'm assuming there was a lot of relationship building before they were able to be vulnerable on screen with you.
Yes, absolutely, Heidi. Like, as I was building this film, I thought, well, how am I going to approach, like, the mother of a feminicide victim? Or how am I going to approach a Native community that is losing their language? How am I going to approach, you know, the family members of murder victims? And the only answer is to be really transparent and collaborative, and to listen, to also listen as filmmakers. We talk about this a lot in the film industry about how do we make films that respect the circumstances of people and that don't exploit them. And in the case of 499, it really was about listening and just sharing my idea and being very clear about my idea, not showing up saying, well, I need this from you and I'll see you later. And so I just actually got back from a tour in Mexico where we went all along the route of the film and screened 499 on location with the people in their communities, in bookstores and cultural centers and plazas and dance halls. And, you know, like, we made the film, you know, connect to their experience, and they got to invite whatever guests they wanted. And we also had forums to discuss the specific issues related to each community member, each character, right? And so that, to me, is what documentary is really about. It's like, you have to have a collaboration with reality. You don't just get to take reality and go make, like, you know, a product with it. There's real people who are still in the struggle, who are still trying to change their universe, and you're a part of that relationship. So it was really interesting, for instance, to see, you know, there's a native poet in the film, to see him talking to the mayor of, you know, the mestizo city next to him, and to see him express the needs of the Nahuatl community, and to express like how there's this opportunity to move forward together if people are willing to listen to each other, you know, and to really dig into the themes. And then we had a screening at the end of the tour at the Commission for Human Rights with Lorena, the mother of Fatima, and she got to talk about feminicide in this really kind of different space where it isn't just like a news clip, it's a film and it's a work of art. And I really do believe everybody in the film is rendered in a very beautiful, like as beautiful as we could do, like in a beautiful manner, because we try to honor like their experience, and their problems are very difficult. The film isn't going to fix them, but we can portray them with beauty. And so that was kind of the conversation that I had with them, and I've always talked to them about doing this tour. So I'm so proud that 3 years later we can actually do it.
Yeah, I mean, I follow your journey on Instagram of the Ruta de Cortés, but I also read this beautiful piece you wrote in La Tempestad, the Mexican magazine, about your, I guess, your Mexican tour and the reactions and I guess sort of your feelings after reuniting with people in the film. Can you maybe share one or two anecdotes of things that you heard from people in the film that after they've seen it now 3 years later, how do they see the impact of the film in their lives moving forward?
You know, it was really incredible to actually connect with the real people in the film, together with the actor Eduardo, who was there with me, and to just get a big hug, you know, to just get that love and to feel like the gratification, because the problem is like these stories are treated as like solution oriented and like really like, well, what's the answer? But because there isn't an answer, many times the story gets lost because it's just another problem. It's just another kind of layer of problems on top of problems, right? And it was just really interesting to give the characters space to voice their frustration with time, right? With this idea of like, you know, 3 years have gone by and my dad's case still hasn't been resolved. 3 years have gone by and I still haven't found my son. But they're so wise and they're so full of love that they also recognize that the film is valuable, that the film represents them in an interesting way. So I remember very much like being in this town of Jalapa in Veracruz and having the screening of the film with Marta, who is looking for her son who was disappeared. And when you're disappeared, you just don't show up. You're just gone. And so what parents end up doing is that they go out and they dig through the terrain looking for mass graves, which is shocking that, you know, regular people have to do that. And she was watching the film and she was telling us just how much it meant to her and how exhausted she was and how at the same time how glad she was, you know, and her sister was there and her daughter was there and they were hugging and we were having dinner and watching like the kids, you know, the young kids at the cultural center were dancing and they were doing fandango, which is like a really kind of Veracruz kind of, you know, musical style that fuses Spain and native sounds and African sounds. And it was just joyous, you know, and it was great to know that even in the midst of all this horror, like we're building all these bonds, you know. And then later Marta asked me for the contact for Lorena, the mother of the girl who was murdered in the film, and you know, they connected on their own too. So I think, you know, cinema has to be experienced, and we built this like 2-week experience that started connecting all these people. One thing that folks have said to me throughout the tour also, like for instance Jorge, like the father, the son of the murdered journalist, he said, well, you know, like, then what are we supposed to do? Are we just supposed to throw up our hands and say it's impossible? Where does that leave us? Where does that leave the victims? Somewhere somebody needs to stop this train, you know. And it just gives you that insight of like, you know, you have to be humble as an artist and you also have to be hopeful. You cannot just like cower down when you confront something really difficult and just go looking for the easy feel-good story.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting to hear this. It kind of when I was watching the film a little bit, reminded me of aspects of Patricio Guzman's documentary films, the Chilean filmmaker who also talks about family members looking for the disappeared members. And there's a part in your film where we hear like voiceover. I think it's a woman's voice. Um, I know it's in the very beginning of the film, but it kind of reminded me of these other films from Latin American filmmakers and this shared history, as you put it. I'm probably making my own connections here, but I do appreciate how it is sort of this thread that connects us in a way also. And it's nice to see that your subject also connected with each other from the film as well.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think you're right. Though I think Latin America has a history of violence, and it's a history of of perpetuating violence. You know,
Mm,
I am very much past the point of like who's to blame in the past. I want to
right.
see who is responsible in the present, and I
Mm-hmm.
think you know, like you said in the film, there's this other voiceover of a woman voice who kind of like is following the conquistador and like talking to him, but she's not talking to him from a place of rancor or
Right.
hatred, and neither did any of the people in the film.
Mm,
Nobody who accepted to work in the film said, oh, I hate this guy, I want to punish him. The most important thing in justice is the truth, is listening to the truth. And that to me was the huge lesson of this film, is like power listening is so transformative. When power is forced to listen, and then of course in the film the conquistador would rather not have to sit with any of the
right.
victims. He would rather just go off and do his own thing and go be in charge again. But he's forced to listen, and I think that's the big lesson for us in our time of our, you know, we are so unable to hear each other, and especially when it comes to difficult, you know, conversations around like the permanence of history, people feel offended. People
Mm-hmm.
feel deeply offended, and we've had that reaction in Mexico too. We've had people just say, well, you know, like this film is really uncomfortable. Well,
Right.
of course it is, because it just shows that the responsibility of today belongs with Mexicans living now. It doesn't
Right.
belong in the past, and we need to address our history in the present. And that's very uncomfortable, because you know, countries have these narratives that make them feel powerful
Mm,
and really like comfortable, right? Like in Mexico, our narrative is that we are like the victorious victims, right,
right.
of this conquest, when we ourselves are exterminating, you know, what's left of our native peoples, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, 68 languages that Mexico has that are in danger of disappearing by the end of the century, and yet our patriotism doesn't account for that. So
Right.
it has to be an uncomfortable conversation, and I think 499 doesn't shy away from making the conquistador really suffer through, you know, these testimonies he'd rather not listen to.
I know. And I think, this is sort of where going back to your point about being an artist and creating art that is not just to not just to show the pretty side of things, but also the reality of the ugly truth, if you will, of our current state of affairs. There were. I'm moving a little bit into the technical part of things, but I really loved the cinematography in the film with Alejandro Mejia. I've spoken to him in the past. And I wanted to find out what that dialogue was in terms of using the widescreen, because it's quite a cinematic and poetic film. And what was that like in terms of the look of the film?
Yes, and I'm glad you brought that up, because Alejandro really like believed in the project from the beginning, and he thought really hard in his photographer's mind of how do you bring together fact and fiction on screen in one canvas. And his proposal was to use this widescreen cinematography, which was really intimidating for me, because I was still thinking like a traditional, you know, I was still thinking like I was thinking like a traditional documentary filmmaker, instead of a filmmaker. And what he said was like, listen, like this is the way that all these big Hollywood stories have been told, like about history, right? This is how Hollywood writes history in widescreen anamorphic. Why don't we take it out into the street with these old, vintage lenses that he had at hand? Why not just hack that look? And I think that worked really well, and it also demonstrated like the inherent, beauty of Mexico, which is underneath every layer. Like the film is so striking and beautiful, and I've had so many people tell me on this tour in Mexico about like how beautiful our country is and how much potential it has, and that was really there from the cinematography. And the other aspect that I think really helped was the fact that he only used available light, which is an incredible challenge for a cinematographer, but that gave the film a painterly quality that made it feel really timeless, because the Conquistador looks like these Velázquez paintings, and then so does reality. It looks like it's all part of the same universe. So we worked really hard on that, understanding that the film had to be beautiful and had to kind of hack this look. And once I kind of got the courage to do it, I felt really like in love with the idea of working in that style, and it really helped to make the film a true epic. Like it feels like an epic. It burns slowly, but it starts to grapple with really big things, and I think the cinematography really supported that.
I think so. It's a really nice compliment to what you're telling us as audiences, or witnesses to the stories that you're about to tell us, because you set us right on the beach, and we already know this is going to be a journey, right? And from there, I feel really invested, because you also had a great actor in Eduardo, whose facial features and his eyes spoke quite a lot, because he doesn't have a lot of dialogue. But as much as I know he's the conquistador, I also want to see what happens to him as he goes on to this epic journey. So kudos.
I think we all of our cultures carry a conquistador inside, and I think we need to understand that character. We cannot just hate that character, because we risk repeating them if we don't understand them. And with Eduardo, he had never been to Mexico at all. He had not ever met me. We met a month before the shoot, and it was all online. He did like a cell phone casting, and he took a big risk, and like the film was shot in sequence, so that opening scene on the ocean was the very first thing that he did. Right. And just to have that kind of courage to come to a country you've never been to and join a film production with this crazy director for 4 weeks is like, wow. But he brought a lot of love to the film. He brought a lot of empathy, and he understood that he wasn't there to defend Spain. He was there to be this vehicle, and he would always sit next to me during the interviews, and we would listen. And that bore really beautiful fruit, because now that we finished this tour, we were able to see the other end of those connections, and how that listening really was authentic. Right. And I think I was lucky in that sense of having, on the one hand, a cinematographer that was committed to the idea, and then an actor who was open to going on an experience and not knowing, where this day is going to end and when is it going to end. Some days were like 16 hours, and he was just open to that, and he understood that we were experimenting to try to make this journey really come to life.
That's interesting. Is this sort of your style of filmmaking, in that sometimes you have this idea and then you sort of put together your team, and then sort of the idea evolves from there?
Well, I think when you're dealing with something that is untested, like a hybrid film where you really are creating this in-between space, like you have to give yourself room to experiment. If you try to grip the story too strongly, it's not going to flow. You're going to get stuck, because you don't really know what's going to work until you're there. A great example is the scene in chapter 3 in the Sierra Madre when the conquistador meets the poet.
Yes.
He's a native poet, and his name is Sixto. And Sixto said, "Man, I don't want to give an interview. I don't want to, talk about stuff. I want to talk in poetry because our struggle, our deepest struggle, is our language,
Right.
is our tongue, right? That's what they call it, la lengua. So like, he just spoke in poetry, and we had to adapt to that request with the film. But it's a very beautiful kind of aside in the conquistador's journey, because the language is metaphorical, it's poetic, and Sixto's talking about really deep things that build images in your mind, and they stay with you. And so we couldn't show up, to Soledad, to his town, and say, "Oh, like, no, this is how it's gonna be. This scene is gonna be like this."
Right.
He's telling us he needs something different. And I think it worked really well when the film was open to listening and to trying new things. But your whole team has to be in that mindset. Everybody has to understand we're trying, and there's going to be days where we're going to trip and fall, and there's going to be days where we're going to really hit it out of the park. Like we have to understand there's a flow to things.
Yeah, and I guess it's a lot of adaptation as well once you're on the ground, shooting and interacting with your real subjects of the film.
Absolutely, like there's a lot of just improvisation, but improvisation within a context. You're not just like willy-nilly trying to figure it out. Like we had like emotional goals for the conquistador in each stage, so we knew like, okay, so we're in like act 3, like he's going to be just completely desperate and trying to find a way out, or in act 1 he's going to be really proud and really stoic and really entitled. And so we had a roadmap, but you have to give yourself room to play within the roadmap. Otherwise, like, why are you making a hybrid film? Why are you bringing all these things together? There's no recipe for it. You're inventing.
Right. And, I'm curious about, I'm aware of time, but I also wanted to ask you about the editing process, because as you mentioned, the scene with the poet, we don't always see him, right? So we hear these beautiful words in the Nahuatl language, and were these decisions made in the editing room? Because there's also this poetic aspect of the film in terms of what we hear.
There was a whole nother journey for the film in the edit. It was a very year-long edit with a fabulous team, with a young Mexican editor named Daniel Chavez Ontiveros, and then Andrea Chignoli, who's a very seasoned Chilean editor, actually. And between the three of us, we would work through the piece. And what we had to come up with is like this idea of balancing the experience for the viewer, because you have to enter this world very slowly. So it takes like, 1 or 2 interviews for the film to really click, right? Because we're building a world, we're building a new world. It's not something that is evident from the beginning. How's this going to work? This conquistador, these real people, like, what am I doing here? So we worked really heavily on that. And then on par with that was this idea of the voiceover. What is the conquistador thinking? What is he remembering from the past? It has to be factual, but it also has to be from his point of view, from like the mindset of a man from the 16th century. So he also kind of lies about stuff. He makes himself really important. He makes himself the guy who gives Cortez all the ideas. But those things are subtle, right? Like, so it took a lot of work to really like make sure that I was saying something that actually happened, and then saying it from his point of view, which I thought was really interesting, because you're hearing it from a soldier who was there, who was there at these decision-making points, and he tells you how they besieged the Aztec capital, and of course he's the one who like does something really important, like cut off the water. But behind all of that are a lot of historical facts and research, and just kind of trying to give people a feeling for that mindset without overwhelming us either with too much information, because there's so many things that happened in that campaign of 3 years between Cortez and the Aztecs. There's so many layers to it. This isn't a history book. This is a film, right? It's an experience. So the edit was a challenge in that way.
Yeah, but I mean, it came out beautifully, and I think what stayed with me is a lot of the quotes from the Conquistador that sound beautiful in Spanish. Like towards the end, he says something like, "Hoy me pregunto qué fue de mi riqueza." So, you know, like he's questioning what came of all these riches I had in the past to where I am now. So I appreciate the fact that you inserted a lot of these, I guess, pensive moments from the conquistador's point of view, because it also kind of means, it makes it more poignant to me as a viewer than hearing a lot of facts about history. That's my personal opinion.
I think absolutely, like hearing this character have this amazing perspective of 5 centuries, and how many historical figures and how many people do we wish had that perspective, right? Like we're talking about climate change now, right?
Yes.
Imagine if we could go 500 years in the future and see the effects of it. It would radically change how we think about it, especially for folks who deny it or who minimize it, right?
Right.
And so I think like he's actually on a journey that is very lucky and fortunate for him, because he's seeing the, you know, the humanity, you know, the scale of humanity in a way that he totally ignored. He was all about the present, you know, and in that way he's not so different from us today. We're very tied up in our present, and we don't think about, you know, like these larger things that we're a part of. You know, climate change will be with us for centuries if it, you know, like if it doesn't get turned back or stopped.
Exactly. So the journey continues for $4.99. You're on your way to New York, is it?
I'm on my way to New York. Tomorrow we premiere at BAM at the Brooklyn Academy of Music. There's a fabulous theater, and then after that we'll be in LA and San Francisco. So the journey continues, and then beyond that, we're going to Canada as well with the distributor Films We Like. So
I love it.
I feel it's a huge, you know, stroke of luck for the film, and a blessing to be present on this 2021, which is the year of the 500th anniversary. And you know, it's important to keep defending this idea of like film in theaters with an audience.
I think so. I mean, I think there's going to be room for both, but I do find that reactions from the audiences in the same theater is really what makes it perhaps even more poignant than it is when you view it on your own. I don't want to forget to ask you if there's anything else that you're working on, or anything else you want to share with us.
Yes, I'm finishing a film now about a friend of mine who's incarcerated, and I've been working on that film for 10 years.
Oh, wow.
I'm hoping that it will be released next year. And basically what's interesting about that story is that I met this young man when I was working in the criminal courts, because I was his interpreter at his murder trial. So I was actually working with him when he was on trial for murder, and we became friends after that. So it's a story of a friendship that starts in the most, you know, harrowing and unusual circumstances.
Excellent. So we'll look out for that, hopefully in the next year or so.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Gracias, Rodrigo. Mucho gusto.
Gracias, Heidi. And sorry